Okay, so today let's talk about the compatibility between J types judgers and P types perceivers. And since everyone complains about my whiteboard, I actually made a PowerPoint. So how do okay, let's see here. And I know that when I wear tie-dye, I look like totally Kyle. If you guys are old enough to remember that, I'll make myself bigger. Okay, so relationship compatibility between J types and P types. First of all, let's talk about like what are J types and P types, because there's this stereotype that if you are organized and decisive, then you are a J. And if you're more open-ended, casual, relaxed, then you are a P. Like most stereotypes, this does have some basis in reality, although I would say that this aligns more, you know, the organization part in particular with trait orderliness in the big five. But overall, we do see a pattern here, but don't type yourself based on that alone. Okay, so what are judgers actually? What determines if you're a judger or a perceiver? Judgers have an extroverted judging function, JE, as one of their top two functions. So that would mean in their top two, they've got TE or FE. Oops. So that's, and if you have one of those in your top two functions, then you also have an introverted perceiving function, PI, in your top two. So that would be SI or NI. I've listed the judgers there, but you guys know which is like the ones that have a J in them. And then perceivers have an introverted judging function, JI, in their top two functions. So that would be TI or FI. And conversely, they would have an extroverted perceiving function, PE, in their top two, either SE or NE. So whether someone is a J type or a P type is really determined by whether their perceiving function is extroverted or introverted. So introverted perceiving functions, you're a J type. Extroverted perceiving functions, you are a P type. Primary extroverted perceiver, P. Maybe you can use that to remember. So how do these types conflict? Unless we have a really good understanding of type, we tend to mistake that everyone sees the world through a similar lens that we see the world. So we think that their mind works like ours, that they're seeing what we see. So there is this conflict with judgers and perceivers that I have noticed, and that John Beebe spoke about in one of his books that I read, is that J types will make the mistake of seeing P types open-ended perceptions as closed-ended judgments, whereas P types will see a J type's judgments as more open-ended observations. And so there's this conflict of understanding each other or not taking each other seriously or correctly. This actually came up with, I have, I don't know if I'd call her an employee, but working for me, and she is an ESTJ. And I said like, oh, like I noticed that you speak really fast. And while you're talking, she bounces off of so many different NE possibilities that I'm like, I never know where it's going. And I end up at the end having a lot of questions where I have to backtrack and hold the questions in my mind, because I'm like, wow, that little rant left me with like 10 different questions on like the different things that you hit on, because I'm always seeking like clarification and to understand. And for me, this was just an observation, like, oh, you talk like this, and I think like this. So, but she took it as like, oh, Kate wants me to slow down. I need to really, she doesn't like when I do that. It like tires her, or yeah, that I don't like it. And I'm like, oh no, that's not the case at all. I just noticed. And it's a hard thing because I notice that judges may, I even want to say perceive, because that's what I do. They may make the judgment that I don't like them, or that I don't like something that they do, but it's really not that. It's really just something that I saw and commented on, but I didn't make a judgment on it. So that is a miscommunication that can happen between judges and perceivers, where it's like, oh no, that's not what I meant. Or why didn't you pay attention when I said this? I said like, that's what I meant. I'm like, oh, I didn't know it was like a thing. So beyond that, we have to look deeper into the functions to examine the compatibility between judges and perceivers, because they do have a different primary orientation towards the world, which can be useful in work relationships. But J versus P says nothing about what cognitive functions they have. It only says something about where those cognitive functions are in their stack. So not all Js are made the same. SIJs, that's our SJ types, focus on individual instances of experience as disconnected from each other, whereas NIJs do the opposite. They focus on overarching patterns that transcend individual experience. Where it's like SI is an individual string, and NI is the thread between all of them. So these two functions, that they cannot work in conjunction with each other. TEJ types, that's our TJs, focus on systematizing and regulating, whereas FEJ types, that's our FJs, focus on validating and affirming. And these are two very different processes from each other. Although I've been studying voltology recently, it's fascinating. There is some shared voltology between like primary extroverted thinkers and primary extroverted feelers. In the same way, not all P types are made the same. SEP types, that's our SPs, focus on external sensory experience through observation and engagement with the objective reality, whereas NEP types, that's our NPs, focus on possibilities formed out of unique juxtapositions between disparate concepts that are divorced from reality. So these two functions cannot work in conjunction with each other because they're doing opposite things. Oops, I bumped the microphone. TIP types, that's our TP types, focus on removing the self from the object in order to analyze it and understand it from an impersonal perspective, whereas FIP types, that's our FPs, focus on inserting the self to be more closely aligned with the objects and in order to appraise it and value it from a personal perspective. So it's personal for the FI user versus impersonal for the TI user. And, reality-based for the SE versus possibility, like abstract-based for the NE. So they're, B types can manifest similarly in their external affect, but the internal process is very different. So are they compatible? It's not really useful to talk about J and P as generalized as a whole in determining compatibility, because there are 4 different possibilities in matches when we're talking about J's and P's. So let's go into the 4 possible combinations of compatibility between these two. So you can have a high SI, SJs with SPs, high SI with high SE, high NI with high NE, that's our NJs and NPs, high NI with high SE, that's our NJs and SPs, and then high SI with high NE, that's our SJs and NPs. So I'll go through each one of those combinations. First of all, SJs and SP types, high SI users and high SE users. So as I spoke about before, SI looks at individual instances of experience, and they really have a great respect for an individual's like personal experience, where SE doesn't as much because it's looking at a lot of different experiences, not just like the one. We talk about SI and SE and NE from one SI to many possibilities NE, whereas SE and NI, it's an opposite process from many SE observations, one NI path. So these two have opposite cognitive functions in terms of their perceiving functions. We're not saying anything about their judging functions here. So both are focused on, the concrete, the practical reality, but they're following completely opposite processes. So dominant SI users and dominant SE users, the ISJs and the ESPs, do find each other initially very attractive and kind of have this magnetic draw to each other. They're quite addictive to each other in the short term, but long term, they have disagreements in how they perceive and approach the world. This is because the first function and the fifth function for them are called, the fifth function is called your opposing function, and that's where they are for each other. So they find each other fascinating, but they do works in direct opposition to the hero, what they're ultimately trying to do. And for this, I'm citing John Beebe. For NJs and NPs, that's our INTJ, ENTJ, INFJ, ENFJ, and the high NE types, ENTP, INTP, ENFP, and INFP. It's a similar process to what we just saw with the SI and SP types. So yes, both are focused on meaning and possibilities because they are intuitives, but they follow completely opposite processes, like I just said in the previous slide. So the dominant NI types, the INJs, and the dominant NE types, we're again seeing this opposing function dynamic where they find each other addictive and fascinating. At first, there's a pull there, but over time, a long-term disagreement because the opposing function is working in direct opposition to the hero. Then we go to NJs and SPs. So these guys have the same perceiving functions of NI and SE, but just a different prioritization of these functions in the stack. They either are more oriented towards the external experiential data and hold back a little bit on narrowing down to the intuitive path, or they are more focused on narrowing down to the one overarching pattern and seeing that with less experiential data. So same process, but more of an orientation towards one versus the other. And the process, they can't exist without each other, though. You cannot form NI patterns and insights without the SE experiential data and vice versa. So those types that have these functions in the middle of their stack, that's ENTJs, ENFJs, ISTP, and ISFPs, are more balanced in terms of these aspects and have an easier time bridging the gap between each other. So we do see a bit of easier communication and compatibility between, for example, an ENTJ and an ISTP, or like an ENFJ and ISFP, or different combinations of the two. But those who are off balance in these functions, so the lead NIs and the lead SEs, especially when they're younger, when they're older, we see that these differences tend to become lesser, but they have a harder time with either the sensory or the intuition. And so communication is more difficult because of the over-reliance on either NI or SE. Then finally, SJs and NPs, this combination works much the same as the NJs and SPs. They have the same perceiving functions, SI and NE, which is internal experiential data to expand to many possible combinations, but prioritized differently. And so they have different roles in the mind. So those with the functions in the middle of the stack, again, the ESTJ, ESFJ, and then the INTP, INFP are going to have an easier time bridging the gap between each other in this aspect. Okay. For example, with INTP and ESFJ, they're still off balance on the TI and FE and opposite to each other there. So they're going to have that to deal with. But on these two aspects, they're of their perceiving functions, they're more on balance, and so have an easier time in communication and better compatibility there. And those who are off balance, the ISJs and the ENPs have a more difficult time bridging the gap between the possibilities and the concrete experience. And so when they're younger, they have less compatibility, but tends to improve over time. So that's it for my presentation. I hope that this was useful to you guys, and please check out the TypeMatch app if you're interested in making friends or looking for a romantic relationship using MBTI and Big 5 compatibility. Thanks.
Your personality is unique. It's hard to find someone that understands you. Try dating using personality type matching. Find out who you're compatible with using Myers-Briggs and Big 5 personality scores. Download TypeMatch and start dating by personality type compatibility today. TypeMatch, available on App Store and Play Store.